Megalania was part of the megafaunal assemblage that inhabited Australia during the Pleistocene, a geological epoch that lasted from 2.58 million years ago to just 11,700 years ago. As I mentioned in the intro, they were the largest terrestrial lizard ever, that we know of anyway, and they reached an estimated length of 3.5 to 7 meters. That's 11.5 to 23 feet. They may have weighed up to 4,000 pounds, or around 1,700 kilograms, and they are thought to have a similar ecology to the modern-day Komodo dragon, which is interesting because they are the current largest lizard on the planet. And the youngest fossil remains we found of them date back to around 50,000 years ago, which is relevant, because it means that it is highly likely, if not almost guaranteed, that early humans, the first indigenous settlers of Australia, could have encountered Megalania. Which would have been an interesting discussion, just a great talk overall. Now, some will point out that Megalania's extinction may therefore be the result of our influence on the environment, but it's worth mentioning that Megalania was already on the decline by the time we showed up, due to competition from other predators in the area, such as the marsupial lion and large crocodiles. Megalania would have been struggling to find food, and our presence would have only made the situation worse, meaning that we weren't the only reason they went extinct, but we probably did help speed it along. Anyway, the first remains of this creature were discovered in 1859, described by Sir Richard Owen, whose name comes up a lot. He noticed 3 vertebrae of this particular animal from a collection of primarily marsupial bones that were purchased by the British Museum. They'd been collected from the bed of a tributary of the Codamine River, which is west of Moreton Bay in eastern Australia. He originally called it Megalania prisca in his paper about the animal, referring to it as ancient great roamer, and he believed it was actually a type of dinosaur at the time, though now we know that it was not in fact a dinosaur, it was a lizard. Additionally, Megalania isn't actually a valid genus anymore, as it is considered a junior synonym of Varanus, hence why its scientific name is Varanus priscus. But people still just refer to it as Megalania for short because it's kind of a cool name. I think that's really the only reason. Size estimates on it vary quite a bit because we just don't have that many remains on this animal. It used to be thought that it could be as big as 23 feet long, but that's been downgraded to about 15 feet. Its food sources would have been medium to large size animals, including a lot of giant marsupials, like the Diprotodon, or pretty much anything they could have gotten a hold of. It's also worth mentioning, and this is deeply alarming, the Megalania may have indeed been venomous, because many of its close relatives, like the Komodo dragon, are known to have toxin-secreting oral glands, which is horrifying. Thank you for that. It's already huge, and now it's going to give us a large dose of venom to boot. Wonderful, wonderful. However, this is currently just a theory, as we don't have enough remains to confirm whether it would have been venomous at all. It's just thought that it might have been, because most of its direct relatives are. But then again, it was so big that it may not have had venom, because why? What for? But as I said, we no longer have to worry about getting eaten by this creature, as they are indeed extinct. The youngest remains that we found date back to the late Pleistocene, roughly 50,000 years ago. As I said, it was possible they were on the decline prior to us showing up. We definitely didn't help. And in fact, their muscular mass may not have allowed them to outrun us if we chose to hunt them. And even if the early humans did just choose to avoid them because scary, we probably outcompeted them, taking away most of their major food sources and rendering the entire species extinct. It's sad that they're gone, but at the same time, Australia already does have saltwater crocodiles, and maybe that's enough for them. Maybe they don't need another giant lizard. That's all I'm saying. Beelzebufo ampinga was a rather large species of prehistoric frog that was first described in 2008. It is commonly known as the devil frog, devil toad, or frog from hell because it was, of course, big chungus. They lived in the late Cretaceous period, and their fossil remains have been recovered from the Maverano Formation in Madagascar. They are assumed to have lived roughly 66 to 70 million years ago, and the fossilized remains of this thing actually were initially discovered back in 1993 by David W. Krauss. It just took 14 years to assemble enough data to publicize the remains in any solid way. Other scientists involved with this were Susan E. Evans and Marce E. H. Jones. Krauss himself was also part of the final publication, which happened to be in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Beelzebufo, if you couldn't guess, is a portmanteau of Beelzebub, which is a demon, sometimes called Lord of the Flies, as well as Bufo, which is Latin for toad, and Mpinga means shield, so devil, toad, shield. The shield doesn't really fit, but whatever. A total of 75 isolated fossils of partial bone fragments have been found so far, and some portions of the articulated skull are also known. Researchers have actually been able to reconstruct parts of the skeleton, including nearly the entire skull, but as is the case with many fossils, the remains have been very fragmentary, but they do have enough to get a rough idea of what this thing looked like and just how big it was. From head to tail, it could have been as long as 20 centimeters. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a frog! That's larger than most people's hands, just so we're clear. Additionally, it may have been slightly armored. Parts of the skull roof show a rugous external surface. That indicates that parts of it may have had bony scales called scutes to protect the animal. Additionally, the skull sutures are actually open, even in the largest specimens available, which indicates that it actually could have grown even bigger than we currently have remains to prove. It was most likely a predator, because it's a frog, and frogs love flies. Though this thing probably would not have eaten that many flies, necessarily. Its expansive mouth allowed it to eat relatively large prey, even juvenile dinosaurs. The bite force measurements on this thing suggest that a Beelzebufo, with a skull width of about 15.4 centimeters, that's 6.1 inches, may have been able to apply between 500 to 2,200 newtons. That's between 110 and 490 pounds. Let me just stress at this point, this is a frog! 2,000 newtons isn't actually enough to break the bones in, say, your leg, but if it were to, say, bite your hand, that might be a bit of a different situation. And at the very least, it would hurt like heck! The fossils, like I said, were found in Madagascar, which separated from the coast of Somalia in the earliest stages of the late Jurassic period, while it was still attached to India, in fact. Beelzebufo resembles horned frogs of South America, which raised the possibility that they could have a close biogeographic link between Madagascar and South America during the Cretaceous period. Beelzebufo's discovery actually reignited interest and research into skeletal variation among living members of the Ceratophoridae, which are the horned frogs from South America. Those investigations suggest that several of the similarities between this animal, as well as the South American frogs, may have evolved by convergence. And yet another study in 2018 suggested that Beelzebufo, as well as other extinct frogs with traits like Ceratophorids, were actually instead part of a more ancient group of Neobacteria. Though another study in 2022 backpedaled on that, going back to the notion that the Beelzebufo actually represents a taxon on the stem of a crown group of those South American horned frogs. But either way, it was a big frog! Keep in mind that the analysis so far is that this is more of a horned frog. And unlike the vast majority of frogs, which actually have weak jaws and typically consume small prey with their long tongues, horned frogs tend to ambush animals as large as themselves, and their powerful jaws play a critical role in that. They're basically the T-Rex of the frog world, is what I'm trying to say. Weight estimates put it at least 10 pounds, 4.5 kilograms. Of frog! What wonders our evolutionary history has to offer. Otodus megalodon, or just simply megalodon, which means big tooth, is an extinct species of mackerel shark, also known as lamniforms, and they lived between 23 to 3.6 million years ago. So they occupied quite a large span in time, in case you hadn't noticed. They were originally thought to be very close relatives of the modern-day great white shark, but further research has actually put them under the classification of the extinct family Odontodidae. That family diverged from the great white shark during the early Cretaceous period, and because its relationships to other sharks has been very debated upon, and any remains we've found of it are very fragmentary, its exact appearance is still somewhat of a mystery. When it was thought to be a close relative of the great white, most artists rendered it as a very, very big great white shark. But it's also thought it could have looked a lot like a whale shark, a basking shark, or even a sand tiger shark. It's pretty much impossible to know for sure without more conclusive remains, and even then there'd be some guesswork involved. Its exact size is also hotly debated. We know it was really, really big, but exactly how big it could get is again very difficult to say. Sharks don't have bones. They have cartilage that makes up their skeletons. It's the same organic material that makes up your nose or ears. Now, it is possible for cartilage to fossilize, but it's much less likely to do so than bones are. And usually the only parts of cartilage that would fossilize would be the very dense components, such as the jaw. As a result, getting solid remains of the megalodon is very difficult, and therefore size estimates vary wildly. Everyone agrees they were huge, but some estimates suggest it was about 16 meters or 52 feet in length, but higher estimates will put them over 20 meters or 67 feet long, and weighing up to 103 tons. Again, it's very difficult to know for sure when the remains are so fragmentary. The only thing anybody seems to agree on is that they were really, really big and terrifying. Their bite force has been estimated, and it's believed their jaws could have exerted up to 182,200 newtons. Another thing that differentiates them from great white, as again people constantly associate with them even though they probably weren't that closely related, is that they didn't hunt like them either. Unlike a great white, which tends to come up towards its prey from below and get at their soft underbelly, like when whites attack seals, Megalodon probably attacked from wherever direction it wanted to. Their jaws could easily break through their prey's chest cavity and puncture the heart or lungs. There weren't very many other creatures that could deal with a megalodon back then, and it's believed that juveniles of the species would hunt very close to shore, and as they grew they'd move a bit further out, feasting upon early whales. But the question is, why do people think they would still be alive? They lived millions of years ago, from the early Miocene to the Pliocene epochs. They're not even close to present-day animals. Well, I think there's a few reasons, and for one, I think people just find them very cool. They are just big, big sharks. And the thing about the ocean is that it's very mysterious and massive, and we find new species all the time, even some species that were long thought to be extinct, like the coelacanth. This causes the gears in people's heads to turn and their imaginations run wild. The notion of a big, giant shark still being alive somewhere out there. But the fact is, if it was there, we'd know about it. It's too big to hide in its normal habitat. They had a cosmopolitan distribution. They were all over the world. Someone would have seen a 67-foot-long shark. It would have happened at some point. Because again, they were coastal hunters. They were in the exact area where human beings are predominantly. So the notion of us missing something this big is simply insane. But, you say, prehistory in the dark. Don't you understand? The megalodon is no longer a coastal hunter. They retreated into the deep, dark abyss of the ocean floor, hiding and waiting to emerge and take back the oceans for themselves. Okay, yeah, see, that's not something that happened at all. Somebody's been reading way too many science fiction novels, and I will explain why. Now, on one hand, deep-sea gigantism is totally a thing. In zoology, it describes a tendency of mostly invertebrates, and sometimes other deep-sea dwelling animals, to be much larger than their shallower water relatives. A good example of this would be giant and colossal squids. So the idea of a very, very large creature, even a predator, existing in the deep abyss of the ocean is not that far-fetched. It could totally be a thing. There may be something else very large that is deep down in the water that we haven't discovered. But I promise you, it's not a megalodon. It can't be a megalodon, because that is a completely different habitat from where the Megs were known to operate. They were surface hunters, coastal swimmers. They did not operate in deep, dark water. Not only would they have to deal with much lower light, but they'd also have to deal with the cold, and part of the reason the Megs died out was due to oceanic cooling. Not to mention the extreme pressure changes, the pressure that will kill a human being if we go too deep in the water. The Meg was in no way adapted for the amount of pressure you deal with the deep sea. And I know where this conversation is about to go. But, prehistory in the dark. This was millions of years. What if the Meg, having to respond in changing conditions in their normal habitat, had to adapt and change their habits and move into deeper water where it was safe for them? And they now wait and plan. And soon they will emerge again and strike? No, that is not... Okay, let's play this game. Let's actually take this thought and use it as a way to explain why that is totally not a thing that happened. Let's say you're right. The Megalodon at some point decided to shift its habits. It began hunting in deeper water. It began to operate in cooler temperatures. And over time, evolution took its course. The species adapted. The ones that could handle the changing environments survived while the older ones died off. And slowly but surely the species moved into deeper and deeper water, but somehow retained their immense size. Okay, let's say that happened. There's one key problem that I don't think you are considering. If it went through that many evolutionary changes, if it altered itself in such a way where it could handle the lower light, where it could handle the lower temperature, where it could handle the immense pressure of a deep sea environment, it wouldn't even be considered a megalodon anymore. It would no longer be Otodus megalodon. It would be an entirely new species. A descendant of megalodon, sure. A related species, absolutely. But it wouldn't be the Meg in the way we think about them. And if it went through so many evolutionary adaptations to be able to function in that deep environment, it could no longer so easily move back into the old environment that the original Megs used to operate in. They couldn't survive in the shallower environment anymore. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this. If there is a gigantic, big, 67-foot long shark somewhere in the ocean, I promise you, it's not a megalodon. I'm sorry that I had to play bad guy on this topic, but there's just no way this thing is still alive. Not nowadays. And honestly, let's be real about this. Do we really genuinely want that? I mean, look at this thing. I don't really want to live in a world where when I go to the beach, I have to be worried about getting swallowed whole. Bitten by a shark is one thing, but if I'm swallowed, I don't even really have a chance of surviving that, you know? It's just one of those things. New Zealand, much like Madagascar, is known for its unique and rather various biology. There's a lot of interesting creatures that exist there that just don't exist throughout the rest of the world. And historically, it was much the same. There are many animals that no longer live there, but when they were alive, only lived there. So paleontologists have been fascinated with New Zealand in general, and it's a good place to look for creatures that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. And one of them was discovered in 2008. It is known as Heracles inexpectatus, or Heracles the Unexpected, named, of course, for the Greek hero Heracles, sometimes called Hercules if you're Roman. And they were parrots, squawking, mimicky parrots that some people keep as tropical pets. But this was no ordinary parrot. Oh no! This parrot was the Big Chungus of parrots. Beyond the name Heracles, the nickname applied to this species, given by paleontologist Mike Archer, is Squawkzilla, because they stood up to 1 meter or 3 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed about 7 kilograms or 15 pounds. They were big, huge parrots. It's believed they were probably flightless, and their closest living relatives, other than regular parrots, would probably be the kakapo, which are also New Zealand natives, flightless, nocturnal, and ground-dwelling, and critically endangered. It's believed there are only 199 living individuals in the wild, and conservation efforts actually started in the 1890s, but weren't actually very effective until 1995. But back to the Heracles, what is the deal with Squawkzilla over here? Why would there be such a massive bird? Well, New Zealand has a history with massive birds, actually. There were plenty of giant birds in New Zealand for whatever reason, like the moa. And in fact, there is the known concept of island gigantism, or insular gigantism, where the size of an animal species that's isolated increases dramatically in comparison to its mainland relatives. So it's likely their isolation on an island led to this particular species of parrot getting so unspeakably large. But the real question then is, why did they go extinct? They lived during the early Miocene, which is about 16 to 19 million years ago. Did we kill them? Well, no, actually, not this time. The ancestors of modern humans wouldn't even show up until the late Miocene, let alone actual Homo sapiens. So we weren't the reason the Heracles went extinct. It could be for any number of reasons, a shift in the climate, or the presence of a new predator species that the parrots simply couldn't evade. Either way, they're gone now, which is sad, but at the same time, would it also not be horrifying to have a parrot that use? I wonder if they could mimic too, like other parrot species can. That would be interesting. A giant talking bird in your house. Like, literal Big Bird, except he's a parrot. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.